Hello, Eric.
Hey,
This
Sylvia. Good to see
is
you.
this is June 16th, 2020. As you know, the archives team wants to interview all the staff during this pandemic. We are now 3 months into this brand new way of being, both personally and professionally as a church community, staying at home and wearing masks when we go out. And I have some questions for you that will give the future generations of our church a glimpse into what it was like during this pandemic time. I also want to ask you some questions about your future now that you're going to be leaving us, which is sad, after 12 years. To begin with, do you want to start with any question? Because you did get the copy of them. Is there anyone in particular?
No. Jump in. I'll follow suit, and we'll take this where it goes.
Okay. How has your past experience helped you in this pandemic crisis?
Um, that's a tough one for me to answer, Sylvia. The first thing I can think of, and this may not be so much past experience. Well, something does come to mind. My mother was a public health nurse. She was an RN. And when I was 9, we moved from New Jersey to the southernmost suburb of Chicago. She had been in the Visiting Nurse Association. And my brother and I was 9, he was 7, probably bitched and moaned, although we wouldn't have called it that, about she was the only mother on the street where we grew up who was working. We were the only latchkey kids.
Oh.
And so each day, Monday we went to one house, Tuesday we went to another house, and we sort of did that through the week. And so we said, for the first year, Mom, we want you to stay home. And she granted that. I think maybe because she didn't want to either. I'm not really sure. But there were no jobs for her in the town. In the area. So what she did was become trained as an EMT and then a paramedic.
Oh.
And most of the calls came in at dinner time. 5:20, 5:40, the beeper would go off. And so we learned to take things in stride. And so maybe that affects some of this. I was in my tweens during that time. The other thing I think of, and I wasn't thinking in terms of this question particularly, but I know that in different times in our nation's history, we've been asked to sacrifice for this or that, often in war efforts. And in my conscious lifetime, now I was born in '64, I'm not including the Vietnam War with this because I really didn't come of age until well after. My generation's never been asked to sacrifice before. And this is the first time, and no one's even using that word, but to have our freedom taken away, one, that's BS. There are sound medical reasons for sheltering in place and wearing masks and being careful. And now that people aren't following those as much, I'm worrying, and I'm feeling the need to make sure I'm protected all the more.
Yes.
And so, I think back to that, and there are times when you have to give up certain liberties for the greater good. And I don't really feel like I'm sacrificing anything. Granted, my job allows me to continue. I'm not out of a job. And that is, I don't want to call it a luxury, but it is a privilege to do that. Those are the things that I can think of in terms with this. The people who are carrying guns and protesting at state capitals, claiming their freedom's been taken away, that's just hogwash. And if a second wave, like it seems like it's beginning in some areas, I can't imagine they're going to be singing that song all that long.
I don't see how it is going to happen either.
Yeah,
so it's
there's no logic there. And I understand being scared. I understand if you're facing unemployment, being angry and all of that. But there are other factors that you can turn to. We can't do anything about COVID except do the research on a cure and be as sensible as possible during
And
this.
it seems as if it's going to be here for quite a while.
It will. It will.
And that's going to affect everything.
Yeah.
Which sort of leads me into the next question.
Okay.
How's your job changed during this whole thing as you've met the challenges of church?
You went to seminary before me, so this is going to mean less to you. When I was in seminary, there was no such thing as email. That came in really my first settled job in the first year. And I remember conversations with board members realizing that we were doing all our work on email. And we had one board member who couldn't afford a computer and didn't want to go there. And we realized, oh, there are some class issues at work and how we do this. And thankfully, laptops became affordable, more affordable, so it wasn't as pressing an issue. But you see me in my one of the bedrooms in the house. This is my upstairs study. I've taken it over. Ann and I had shared it. This is now my study in my studio. And you see the dog crate behind me, which I'm covering. Sammy sleeps in there every night. It's all on Zoom. Thank goodness we have it, and on the cell phone.
Maybe you should explain what Zoom is.
Oh, sure. For those not quite in the 21st century yet, Zoom is a video call platform, a software that is both available on portable devices and on desktops and laptops that allows us to have video calls. I remember when I was a young boy, when my parents felt that I was old enough to watch Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001, they had a video phone, and I was like, oh, I want one of those. Well, I'm in front of it right now. Things do come to light.
Yeah.
And I've been using Zoom for several years with the UU Partner Church Council. We have our board members, the meetings this way. So had been on Zoom for several years prior to that. Some congregations have partner church congregations use it internationally. We've not been able to set that up in Bulan, Romania yet, but it is an invaluable tool.
So what was the learning curve for putting worship on Zoom?
Oh my God. I'm in the middle of that. I have to host again this Sunday. I hosted 2 weeks ago. Hosting a Zoom call, creating the content, and working in partnership with others. Thankfully, we've got a great staff who their knowledge exceeds my own in this. But I'm having to edit videos, and you can't see it here, but I've got lights in the studio well, that one's not very bright right now. I'm not sure what's going on. So that I don't look completely flat or washed out. And, we're doing video interviews during the First UU Online, the weekly things. I've been doing Curiosity Fridays. I've got 1 or 2 more of those before that runs its course. But I'm using a teleprompter. If I record a reflection, I've got a teleprompter app on my iPad, and I've had to practice with that. And Lord, it takes some getting used to, because it goes at one speed, and I like to talk quickly and then slow down. That doesn't work with the teleprompter.
Oh, I didn't even know there was such a thing.
It cost me $15, and if I'm doing live stuff, which I prefer, I don't need it. But if I'm doing a reflection, I want a little more quality control, so I do that.
Right.
And I'll do that, I think, for this Sunday. So there's all this tech stuff that if you don't do, you're nowhere. We do, First UU does a little more elaborate service because we've got a larger staff that we are able to incorporate more voices. Um, and, you know, we do for the worship service, it is a webinar. And then we start with another call that is a call like this for coffee hour so people can see each other's faces in real time.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that in a webinar, but the webinar gives you a lot more control to put out a package message. I can't even begin to be clear about that, Sylvia. Everything is different. Everything is different.
Do you think it's going to affect worship in the future?
I do. I do. One of the things we've talked about, and we'll see how this all plays out. I think the plan is for First UU Columbus to go with one when we can meet in the sanctuary at church. We'll probably just do that once a Sunday morning, and then we'll live stream it as well, so people who can't get there will have a live experience.
Okay.
And I think we're going to have to, you know, yes, we'll have a vaccine at some point. Yes, we'll have a cure. I also think people are getting used to doing things more in their home. I think we're going to lose most of our movie theaters, and I think that's a lot to lose. I think going to a movie and having a shared experience is fun. I like that better than sitting on my couch most of the time. And it's even more important on Sunday worship. But I think more people are going to be opting out. I think this is going to, for lack of a better phrase, I haven't really come up with this. We're going to be more isolated. We're going to have privatized experience instead of unified. And I hope I'm wrong, but I think some of this will continue in the culture. And I hope I'm wrong.
Eric. I think that's true.
And I think we're going to lose a lot.
Yeah, well, I think that the trick will be to combine the two, the face-to-face events, the bonding events, and then the Zoom or whatever it is going to be. It's going to change.
I think it will.
So,
I think it will.
is there anything else you want to add about the COVID experience?
I was in college when I first heard of AIDS, and I was in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it felt, you know, San Francisco, it felt very far away, and I realized quickly that that was completely wrong thinking on my end, and this hit more of us quicker than that, but the early days of this did bring my mind back to that. And then when I was doing my chaplaincy, I did it at San Francisco General in the inpatient AIDS ward. I spent a lot of time there before antiretrovirals. And you know, I saw a lot of people once or twice, and that was it. They were gone. That was a harrowing experience. I haven't yet lost a close loved person to COVID-19, although I know people who have. And I know that when that happens, it's not a question of if, but when, that's going to take another, my experience of this, like anyone, will change when it comes closer to home.
Yeah, I think you're right. I just thought of another question.
Oh, yeah.
You are the pastoral minister. How did COVID affect your pastoral ministry with the church?
I couldn't go visit people in the hospitals. It was harder to say goodbye to people that I wanted to say goodbye to. And in one case, I won't give a name because this is a historic document, and in some ways it doesn't matter who. You know, not being able to make hospital visits was awful, just horrific. It's not, you know, I want someone to have their pastor visit and tell them, you know, to share the love and care of the congregation, and also be able to say goodbye. wasn't, 2 or 3 people I wasn't able to do that. And that's just a wound. That and all pastoral care is on the phone now or via Zoom. And now that I'm leaving, I'm responding to emails and phone calls. And this Sunday, there's going to be a going away party in the parking lot. Sort of the phrase has been used, drive by. I don't really like that phrase, but I understand the sentiment. But I'm not going to be able to hug people.
That's right.
I still can't get my head around that.
Yeah.
It's, and I know that there will be a vaccine. I know that there will be a cure. So what we're in is just a different time. But saying hello and saying goodbye to people now is fraught. It's just not the same.
You're right. It definitely is not.
Yeah.
And the farewell party is going to be a totally new experience.
But I'm glad we're doing something. We're doing our best.
That's correct.
And that's what we can do.
Mm-hmm.
That's what
Yep.
we can do.
Yeah.
And I will say this, I'm going to Racine, Wisconsin, and Racine has, they're one of the hot spots in the nation right now. And my wife and I were there, Ann and I were there last week to find a place to live, and people were not wearing masks in the grocery stores and in the gas stations.
They weren't.
They weren't. I saw maybe a handful the entire 3 or 4 days that we were there. And, it's not like you want to go to someone and say, why are you wearing your mask? What's that about? I don't get it. But I really wanted to play cultural anthropologist and get a sense of this.
Mm-hmm.
Is it nihilism? Is it just giving up? Is it not believing? I don't get it. I just don't get it. Because you're endangering yourself and you're endangering others, and that's just selfish.
Yeah. That's one thing that I've noticed in Columbus, that certainly in the grocery stores that I go to, people do wear masks.
Yeah.
The great majority of people do.
Yeah.
We haven't been any other place.
Well,
yeah. I think that's not always true in the restaurants and stuff, but
right.
Certainly in the grocery stores it is.
Right. Driving back, there's a burger place that does farm-to-table burgers just outside Indianapolis. The Mug on Apple Street in Greenfield. Let me do a plug. And they were really good. You had to call in your order, and they told you we'll be ready in 15 minutes. And they've numbered the parking spaces, and you call them when you're there, and they're doing it right. But a lot of places weren't.
Wow, that's discouraging to see. Yeah. What if we're going to go back to, or not back, we're going to your experience as the minister here in Columbus? What have you learned over these 12 years?
Oh God, I was afraid you were going to ask that. It was on the sheet of questions that I had in advance. I'll know more in a month or two with some distance and some space.
Yeah.
What I can say now is what I would say about any church. Churches are more important than we realize as institutions and as communities. They're both. And the proudest moment I had, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, was when it must have been in 2012 at the Justice GA in Phoenix, Arizona. Our religious educator, Jolinda Stevens, myself, Ben Knighton, who was then our young adult chaplain, is now a hospital chaplain from the humanist perspective at Riverside. We took 4 youth to be part of that experience, and they helped with voter registration, and we all went and hopped on the buses to make a large protest at Sheriff Joseph Arpaio's tent city, where they were holding undocumented immigrants. And we went in the night because it was the only time humanly possible to do that. It was too hot during the day. And we learned earlier that day that there would be a counter protest. And because of Arizona's carry laws, we can expect people with firearms counter protesting. And so Jolinda and I divvied up. We each had 2 families to call, and we called the parents. And every single parent that we called said, our child is going if they want to go, because it is important to stand on the side of what's correct. We're not going to be intimidated, but Eric or Jolinda, keep our daughter safe. These were all girls, young women. And it was a peaceful protest, and there were no incidents, thankfully. I mean, we saw them. We saw the weapons that they brought with them and the placards and all of that. But they were clearly separated from the rest of us. And, you know, I learned that courage is alive and well. And that was an important lesson for me. We would have respected any of the parents' wishes. But the congregation as a whole, based on those 4 parents' decisions, rose up at least several notches in my estimation, and it was high already. I couldn't have been more proud of the church.
Yeah.
That
was certainly true when I can't quite remember when it was, when we took the youth to Washington, D.C.
Oh, yes, yes.
And
yes.
So many of the coming of age youth and other youth from the church stepped right up and got on that bus for that long ride.
Oh, that was a long ride.
But that was another instance that certainly for me spoke well of the youth that are coming.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And just incredible. So.
Well, and the youth that, you know, this was the March for Our Lives DC. We had a lot of youth there. We had a lot of adults, some chaperoning, some tagging along.
Yeah.
For me, the problem there was just the crowd. I mean, just phenomenal. And not knowing where people were, that was my anxiety.
It was my anxiety too.
But it was a cold day. It was a long day. We slept on the floors and couches of, what was it, the church in, I'm forgetting now, Sylvia, Fairfax, Virginia?
No, not Rockville. Yeah, outside of Washington.
And they were great hosting us.
Mm-hmm.
They certainly had done this before. They had the little chemical hand warmers. Never saw those before, but boy, was that helpful.
It certainly was.
And it was a long day, and our kids were just phenomenal.
They were terrific.
Our youth.
Yeah. How have you seen the church evolve, and what do you see as its future? You talked a little bit about this in terms of the new way of doing church.
Yeah, I think we're becoming actually a little more nimble. When I was new to the congregation, one of the things I heard, and heard it said and also heard it rallied against, was that this is a church that changes slowly. Like a big ship has to change, move a little slower to turn. And I know that distressed people. Certainly I've seen examples of that. I've also seen examples where things moved like that when they needed to.
Yeah.
I said this in my annual report a couple weeks ago, that Jennifer Brooks, our interim minister following Reverend Bellatini, talked about, this church could be a flagship church, the largest Unitarian Universalist church in the state, in what was then the Ohio Meadville district. And I would love to see this church take on more of that role. I think COVID is going to challenge that. We're having to realign some of the staff, and I think that's, I'm pausing here. I don't want to give people the idea that I think it's a bad thing. Actually, I think it's overdue. And I want to be really clear about that. I think some of these changes have needed to happen for some time. And I don't pretend to know what all of them are. I haven't been in on those decisions. But we have to do it wisely. I mean, the church, the sense of community in the congregation is very strong for many people, but not for all. We have to work on, and I'm really glad we have moving Kelly McNeil up to full-time to be our congregational life coordinator. She started last year as half-time. We've got to be integrating people better as they move in. COVID is certainly challenging that, and that will stay the course for a while, but give us time to beef that up and really fine tune how Kelly's going to do that. And I'd love to see this congregation be bold, just like those families were with their kids in Phoenix, and the families of the youth who went to DC and said, we want to be part. This is something historic. We want our youth to have this opportunity. And I'm pausing, Sylvie, because I'm remembering one of the young women. This was her third time marching in DC in the previous year and a half. Ours was the third, and I was like, I didn't know about that. That's great. So clearly the good things are at work, whether the church is doing them or not. The families are giving these youth phenomenal background, phenomenal experiences. Yeah, I'd like to see the church as a whole continue to be bold and think about all the successes. I'm embarrassed to realize that I was at the church 6 years, and on my resume it says that I worked with Cambodian immigrants and refugees in St. Paul, Minnesota before going to seminary. And only after being at the church 5, 6, 7 years, learned that the church had hosted a Cambodian family, had sponsored a Cambodian family back in '84. I was like, why did not we talk about this? Why did it take so long? And that was a sad realization. I'm not sure why that was. Those are things we need to be celebrating. The congregation has really reached out and done amazing things that it should be extremely proud of. But if you don't remember those things, how can you be proud of them?
And I think that's one of the roles that the archives team is trying to fulfill, to bring those kind of experiences to the forefront for the congregation, because a lot of people don't know. But it takes searching back in the historic records and finding those things, and the archives are doing that. And that's why we want to do the interviews.
Sure.
So it doesn't get lost.
I'll lift up a couple of things. When we were talking about starting a campus chaplain, the archives said, here's some history. And they gave us, the church had been doing campus ministry from the Second World War. First UU, First Unitarian at that time, and 2 different liberal Christian denominations had a house on Indianola. And it's ebbed and flowed, but they were able to say, here's a history. That's phenomenal. Can I take the archives team with me? The church I served in Rochester before coming here, Rochester, New York, housed the New York Universalist Archives. But it was really just one member of that church and a very large storeroom that I did not have a key in, but I could look through the window. They've been renting space at the Rochester Universalist Church for years, and churches. So
it wasn't really a church project.
No, it was an archives of the state.
Right.
Yeah, it wasn't a church project. But
the trick is to find someone in the congregation who's passionate about the history.
Well, First UU Columbus is lucky because there are many of you.
Yeah, it is good. What do you look forward to in Racine?
Well, as far as our congregations go, it's a fairly old one. The church was founded in 1842. People may or may not remember the name Olympia Brown. This is the Olympia Brown Unitarian Universalist Church.
Maybe you need to explain who Olympia Brown is.
Olympia Brown, excuse me, I've got 2 FedEx trucks back to back. Something weird is going on outside. Transfer or something. Olympia Brown was the first woman ordained to parish ministry in the United States. And I don't remember, or didn't do my homework on when that ordination took place, but she did serve our congregation in Racine for several years. And the church pulpit is the pulpit that she preached from back then. And with COVID-19, I'm hoping at some point to be able to preach from that historic pulpit. It's not guaranteed, but maybe I'll just go in and film me if at least there'll be that. And Racine is an old town. It's a town that's beginning to have an economic rebound. We'll see if that's able to continue. The block where the church resides, the entire rest of the block has been raised, and is waiting for development. So it looks rather depressed from the outside. I've not been inside yet, but the outside doesn't look good. The inside, I've seen pictures, look glorious. It is across the street from the county courthouse. There have been protests there, but there's plastic sheeting on the stained glass windows so that they don't worry too much that the church had been damaged. And I'm curious, they've been involved in something called the Racine Interfaith Coalition. I'm curious what they're doing there. Racine and Milwaukee to the north, Racine's the largest city just south of Milwaukee. There are racial and economic tensions that are very lively there. And I'm very curious to learn what the congregation's role and reputation is. And I'll be there for their last bit of interim time before calling their next settled minister. So I may not be intimately involved, but I'm looking to meet the players and get a sense of what they've been doing and what they aspire to do in the future.
Oh, that sounds like interesting work.
I think it's going to be. I really can't wait.
Yeah, that's good. Well, we wish you well, but we'll miss you. Miss you, but
I will miss you, Sylvia. I will miss you. And the rest of Archives and the rest of the congregation.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts or questions?
I think First UU Columbus is a phenomenal congregation that, let me say this, because there's a bit of a parallel and then a huge difference. First Universalist Rochester, where I did an interim year before coming here, was a depressed church. They and First Unitarian had been 4 blocks apart, both downtown congregations with about 400 on Sunday morning. And they were both thriving congregations. The First Universalist built a beautiful octagonal brick building and got designation by New York State or the feds as an architectural, I don't remember what the phrase was. But the Unitarians saw white flight happening first, and they moved to the edge of the city. They moved as close to the suburbs as you can get and still be in the city limits. And then white flight happened and the decline of the downtown area. And both congregations were downtown churches. Because of their beautiful building that they loved, they weren't able to sell it. HUD wouldn't let them. The feds wouldn't let them.
Oh.
And I'm sure there are details of that history I'm simply not remembering. And so they lost a lot of people, and no one wanted to come to things downtown. And so their membership dwindled and dwindled and dwindled from 400 on Sunday morning to maybe 75. And during the year I was with them, the search committee and the transitions team that I worked with most closely sponsored a number of tea and dessert gatherings. And we used appreciative inquiry questions, like, What keeps you coming to the church? What do you like best? These are not rocket science questions. But it was the first time members of the church heard one another talk positively about the congregation. And so the mood of the church began to change. And they were bringing in a new settled minister. And so by the time I left, there was this sense of positive optimism. It was wonderful. It's not that First UU Columbus is depressed. I would never say that. I've never felt that. But I don't have a sense of people saying, yes, this is our church, and we can't wait to see what the church is going to be. And I think the church deserves that and more. I think, yes, COVID-19, this sort of historic time that we're in, you have to go to brass tacks, and the pastoral nature is just, I've been checking in with more people than ever on the phone, just checking in. And we've got UU Cares, and we've got 30 people making daily or weekly calls to folks. So that's a job I'm sharing with others. But I'd really like to see the congregation, when we're able to meet back in person, when we're able to see, light at the end of the tunnel, really say, what's the next project? What's the next milestone? And I can't wait to hear what that's going to be. I just can't.
What a wonderful vision with which to leave us. Thank you so much, Eric. I appreciate this a lot.
You are welcome, Sylvia.